It must have started over 15 years ago. A Mandingo had called us up and he told us that he had found out about a burial ground right across from Flushing Cemetery.
The Flushing Town Cemetery is one of many, several cemeteries that were public cemeteries across New York City. There were three in Queens. That one was established in 1839. The town purchased property specifically to have a town cemetery, and so it was meant for indigents and unknowns, which unknowns are people that aren't claimed usually by family members. But it also transformed over time, as you know, to be an African American cemetery. And when Queens became consolidated with New York City, it was already public property. So anything that was public property owned by a town automatically became New York City property.
So Mandingo was very interested in it, and he was wondering why wasn't it still a cemetery? It was a playground with a wading pool and that kind of thing. And he did a lot of research into it, and he found out that it was a burial site, and it was very upsetting to him. And then he told us he would like us to be on the Conservancy to help reclaim it, rename it, and make sure it gets refurbished.
What Mandingo did had not been done with any other site that was turned into a park. It was like New York City growing. It was New York City growing. You may have a cemetery here, but this is no longer going to be a cemetery, and it's our land, and we're taking over, and they just made it into a park. All of New York City is like that, a lot of the Bronx. All the places that were previously cemeteries, they didn't have a Mandingo fighting for them.
In, I'd say, 2002, my son was in 5th grade, and he had to do a school project on interview someone in your community who's lived there a long time. So I said, okay, most of the kids, they'd interview their next door neighbor or their father. So I said, why don't we interview this person that I keep seeing on in the news all the time, Mandingo Shaka. So he came over to our house and he gave a very good interview with my son, and they hit it off very well. And we found out a lot about what it was called Martin's Field at the time, and how it was a playground at the time, kind of a decrepit looking playground, but and how that it can't be called a park because it's a cemetery. People are buried there.
I think about 7 or 8 years ago, the Parks Department wasn't maintaining this space, so it's got overgrown, and so the Conservancy complained and was creating a little bit of fuss, and so the park supervisor at that time was a friend of mine, and he asked me if I can bring some volunteers and help the Parks Department clean up, and that started a few times a year. We would come and clean up, and eventually the Conservancy asked me to join with them, join the board.
I had been interested in the site, but I didn't know the Conservancy existed. Otherwise, I would have joined them long before, because I thought it was really important that this site be acknowledged, because I see it as a bigger instance of American history where an African American and Native American site has been, literally paved over in this instance, and people were fighting against the recognition.
When we heard about it, and we heard that it had been desecrated the way it was, we were very shocked, and it's just a terrible tragedy, really, and we thought we'd better help out and do whatever we could to make it to make amends.
Yes, to do the right thing.
Right.
We had done some research on the Guy Martin that it was named after. This is one of the articles that we found that the Guy Martin wrote about black folk, which made us immediately want to have the name changed. He didn't say very nice things about black people. Somehow or other, we don't really know how, I don't really remember how we arrived at the old town of Flushing burial ground. But when we did that, when that name came out amongst us, the Conservancy, it just stuck because it didn't pinpoint any particular people. And we thought, this is good.
So I didn't look at it as a park or a burial ground. It was for me, it was like a sacred space. That's something we needed to pay homage to history here, and keep it well maintained.
We want to make sure it remains as a burial ground,
Right.
and that
It's a holy place.
It's and should be respected.
Right. Right.
And that was our main mission to, respect and to protect
Right.
the grounds.
So I don't think most people know, even though there's a sign, that it's a burial ground where people are buried underneath, 500 to 1,000. And I think without that, there was an archaeological survey done in the 90s that Mandingo had encouraged to be done. And without that, I think it would be a playground today. Because, a lot of people thought, well, maybe it used to be a burial ground, but that, solidified the fact that, verified the fact that, there are, up to 1,000 people buried there. And in our quest to have some type of headstone is how this new construction has come about, with a larger memorial and the additional names, which Rudy found, added to a memorial wall.
I did submit my hand-drawn thumb with the etchings of the 4 headstones to Parks, and they worked with that. This was my version of what I offered them as a thing instead of the 4 headstones. This is after Rudy's work. All these little lines are all the names of the people that he found. But I etched in the headstones and handed it into Parks, and that's when they came up with the memorial that we're going to be getting.
People are waking up to different things, and I think it's going to be a much more positive thing coming up.
Right.
Right.
It's happening in other places where people are trying to reclaim the site as it's, as it would naturally be, a cemetery. So this is part of a bigger wave as well, looking back, saying these sites were mistreated, misused, and people collectively have been trying to reclaim these sites.
I can only present my case and say to you, read the signs that say what this is. Read the signs that say once upon a time there were Quakers who believed that there ought to be a burial ground for Native Americans and African Americans. Read the signs that tell you the history of this site and be respectful of the site for what it is. This is a cemetery. There are people buried here. There are people buried here. The fact that you don't see headstones doesn't mean they're not here. They're here.